I'm Ken Spector. I'm here today with Robert Stone, who's the director and producer of Earth Days, which is a zeitgeist film. Robert, what inspired you to make this film?
Having kids, is an easy answer. I think more importantly, I feel that everybody now is sort of overwhelmed with all this information about this various environmental crises that we're encountering. The water crisis, the food crisis, the climate crisis, obviously the energy crisis. And I wanted to make a film that would put all of this, take a step back and put all of this in context and make a film about how we got to this point, how we arrived here, because most environmentalism is a forward-looking enterprise. It doesn't tend to look back. And I feel that the environmental movement would be well served at this juncture to take a look back at where it came from, its many successes, its stumbles, and just to also explain, how after knowing our predicament for 40 years now, we have arrived at this moment of crisis. So that's what the film's about.
Yeah. As you were researching for the film and putting the film together, did your goals change at all as far as how you were going to create?
Yeah, they did. I initially started off thinking that this would be a pretty straightforward history of our awakening to the crisis and the movement. And it became pretty clear early on that there was a much more interesting story to be told than just that. And I think the key insight for me came early on that this story is really about a change in perception. That's almost, I feel, in the course of my lifetime, we as a species took an evolutionary leap. And in terms of our relationship to the Earth. And this is expressed in the film, I think, really beautifully by Rusty Schweiker, who was an astronaut on Apollo 9, who, as a result of a technical glitch, is the only astronaut ever to have 5 minutes in space, untethered, with total radio silence, with nothing to do. And he had this kind of really heavy revelation. And he expresses it beautifully that the Earth has nurtured life on this planet for billions of years. It nurtured us. And now, because of the number of us and the degree to which we influence our ecosystem, it is now our turn to nurture the Earth. So he puts it in this phrase, it is now the child that now sees its mother and now must nurture and care for the mother. And that to me is an evolutionary leap. But the film is largely about that change in perception.
And as you were researching the film, were there certain things that shocked you that perhaps you didn't include in the film?
I remember as a kid how bad the pollution was in the 60s. I was shocked to know that, to learn that on Thanksgiving Day 1966, 400 people died in New York of air pollution during an inversion. That was pretty shocking. And I would say the other real surprise was that Richard Nixon turned out to be our greatest environmental president. I never thought I'd make a film that would put Richard Nixon in a good light. But he wasn't an environmentalist, but he was a very clever politician. He was responding to a groundswell of public disgust with the environment, and signed into law the greatest streak of pro-environmental legislation of any president.
How did you go about choosing the 9 people you chose to narrate the film?
Well, I knew that I wanted the film to be grounded in personal narrative. There's no narration to it. It's their personal stories. So I wanted people who had lived the story, where their life story is the story of the film. And I wanted there to be enough of them to do justice to the magnitude of the story, but not so much that it's no longer a personal film. So 9 people was the outside. There's 3 main characters. I picked them. They all, in some sense, to me, represent like different spokes in the wheel of all these people who came from different backgrounds and different places in their lives, and kind of arrived at the same point around the time of Earth Day. And so in some sense, they represent the different branches of the environmental movement that came together.
I'd read another interview that you had done where you weren't quite sure of the impact of movies or media in general. What do you think could create change on the planet
Well, I've,
on a grand scale?
At a number of film festivals, there were these panels I'm always asked to be on about whether documentaries can really affect change or how can they affect change. And I've always been sort of the cynical one, saying, well, yeah, we do these documentaries, we feel good about doing them, but we're largely preaching to the converted, and I don't think they change the world. I have to say I've revised that recently, because I've seen some films recently that have actually had a big impact. I think Super Size Me really had a big impact on people. Not as a work of cinema, but it had a huge impact on waking people up to the dangers of junk food. And Inconvenient Truth, I don't think anybody can argue that that film hasn't had an impact on raising consciousness. Mm-hmm. So I think films can, but documentary films are seen by a small fraction of the American public, who are probably wealthier demographic, who are probably more inclined to, in terms of the environment, more inclined to live a green lifestyle than a lot of other people who really need to see this stuff. So I don't know. Anything that helps get the word out is a positive thing.
Speaking of green lifestyle, do you live a green lifestyle, or do you feel you do?
I do my best. I lived in New York City for 20 years. I recently moved into a small little town in upstate New York. My studio where I work is 100 yards from my house, so I walk to work. I rarely use my car. We compost, we recycle. We have an old house that we insulated and bought a new high-efficiency furnace for. So stuff like that I do. I'm not a saint. I'm no better or worse than anybody else. I try to buy local food, things like that. And also just as a consumer, I try to support local stores and not go to the mall. I don't go to superstores, things like that.
How has your perspective of the environment changed since you made the film?
I think I've actually become a lot more hopeful. I think I was a lot more cynical about our prospects before making this film. But talking to people like Stuart Brand and Hunter Lovins and Rusty Schweikert and these people who really and everybody in the film really who's dedicated their life to this, and they're still going at it. They still feel that we can make a change. Even though so many of the scientists say, what we really need to do is start adapting to the changes that are coming, not holding them off. I actually believe, and the film points out, that rapid social, political, and technological change has happened in my lifetime. I've seen it. It can happen again. So, I mean, look at a week ago, Nissan announced they're coming out with a car next year that goes 375 miles a gallon. Yeah. Cars they average now like 28 miles a gallon. If that's what you can do in 1 year, that's pretty amazing.
In every film or every documentary, there are limitations in terms of time constraint overall. Mm-hmm. What did you feel in this documentary were some of your limitations, or did you feel there were limitations?
Well, I obviously couldn't tell the story of the entire environmental movement because I think there are two periods to it. Maybe there are three periods now. I think there's that. In fact, if you took into account the conservation movement, and before you could go back to Teddy Roosevelt. So say there are four periods. You have the conservation movement. You have the environmental movement that I made a film about. You had the sort of 30 years in the wilderness, where it kind of morphed into an anti-nuclear movement, and it was struggling to really find its footing. And then you have the moment now, which is sort of a rebirth of what came in the late 60s and early 70s. So I wanted to make a film which was really a backstory to what's going on right now. I feel it's very directly related to the movement now, but it's the story. If you don't know how we got here, and don't know how this movement arose and how it succeeded and where it failed, you're gonna be like throwing paint at the wall and going forward. So I think it's an essential history for any environmentalist to know.